So, back to the differential diagnosis. Let me remind you, what is the differential diagnosis? It's a list of possible diagnoses, usually kind of 4 to 6. Too long differential diagnosis, too long list is not going to be helpful. And very limited differential diagnosis. I cannot put just one diagnosis and say this is my differential diagnosis. What are you differentiating? So it's a list, kind of around 5, which may explain the patient's presentation. It should be prioritized in a descending order of likelihood. And the framework and the differential diagnosis are not the same thing. The framework is not specific to the patient symptoms, while the differential diagnosis is specific to the patient's symptoms. In general, a typical presentation of a common disease is more likely than a typical presentation of a rare disease. So what's common is common. When the patient has a common disease and the presentation is an atypical presentation, this will be still more common than the typical presentation of a very rare disease, because don't forget, what's common is common. Now, a good differential diagnosis should include 4 types of diagnoses. The first type is the most likely diagnosis, the one that you believe most likely is going to be the patient's diagnosis, and this we describe as the working diagnosis or the provisional diagnosis. The second one is you put kind of 2 to 4 diagnoses that are very common diseases in general, for which the patient case could be either typical or an atypical presentation, and we call this the common diagnosis. The third type of a diagnosis is any diagnosis which is rapidly fatal if untreated, of which this patient case could be a result of. And we call this type the don't miss diagnosis, And finally, any diagnoses which are specifically suggested by some standout features of the patient's history, like unusual hobby or travel to certain exotic location. Most of these will turn to be kind of a distraction, or what we call the red herrings. So these are the components that should be included in our differential diagnosis. We start with the provisional diagnosis, followed by some common diagnoses, and don't forget that don't miss diagnosis, because you can miss a patient's life if you miss that diagnosis. And finally, if there was something unique in the patient's history and might point to some diagnosis, you want to put it as well.